Welcome to our second session. Today, we'd like to introduce you to what we actually talk about when we refer to economics as a science, and to some methodological principles derived from our definition of the discipline. We'll start by placing economics in the realm of the sciences more generally. Then, we will explain why we think that economics should be defined as a science of markets and outline what we deem as core characteristics of markets. We will introduce what we call mechanistic approach to economic modeling and interdisciplinarity as we perceive it. Finally, we will reflect on the interaction between economics and the real world, entailing the core concept of reflexivity.
Well, at first glance, this agenda looks quite abstract. After all, we want to outline principles of economics, not the philosophy of science. Shouldn't we follow the prescription of many economists to just do it, instead of spending time on these issues?
I would strongly disagree. As we will see, the failure of reflecting fundamentals has contributed to many developments in mainstream economics that are deeply problematic. Economic imperialism, exclusive focus on quantitative models, taking statistical data for objective reality, and others. We need to clarify the basics in order to establish new principles of economics, as our book title promises. There's rich reward to be gained in later chapters.
Let us start with economics as a science then. At first glance, what this means seems to be relatively obvious. Economics, like any other science in the Enlightenment sense, tries to achieve objective explanations on how economic systems operate from an outside and neutral point of view. The state-of-the-art way of doing this is to follow the natural sciences in establishing quantitative models that can then be empirically tested against reality. Is there a problem with this?
Well, there are in fact many issues involved here. The first is that the natural sciences are of course not the only possible point of reference. Think of history. No doubt, historians pursue causal explanations, but they often cannot rely on quantitative data and need to understand unique features of individual phenomena, such as the biography of a political leader or cultural behavior patterns of a certain society. This understanding, or verstehen in German philosophical language, goes hand in hand with explaining, German erklären, which aims at regular and recurrent patterns on which standard hypothesis testing can apply.
But is this distinction relevant for economics?
Certainly. We have already seen in the first chapter that an economic system, such as the traditional Chinese market economy, can exhibit quite unique features that must be subject to verstehen. At the same time, this economy certainly exhibits patterns that are more universal to markets as well, which can eventually be tested quantitatively, such as the relation between geographical proximity and trade intensity.
How can we conceptualize the place of economics in the sciences then?
Our book lays out a concrete proposal in the form of a simple but workable framework here. We distinguish three views on reality. The first-person view is a strictly subjective view of one person, A, on another person, B, or an object. The second-person view refers to some intersubjective understanding between persons as a result of mutual observation, communication, and transaction. This can again refer to another person or persons, such as a historical judgment. Or it can refer to an object, such as a religious artifact. The third-person view is established by an external observer and commensurable with any other observer, referring to persons such as in medicine, objects such as in physics or chemistry. but it can also possibly refer to media of second-person views, such as in linguistics.
How is this applied to economics then?
Well, the basic idea is that economics contains elements of all three views, and as a science should encompass, or in more philosophical terms, triangulate them. Think of the following examples for the measurement of economic well-being. There are measurements of subjective happiness, which clearly refer to a first-person view. Now imagine that A and B are buyers and sellers on a market. They can reach an intersubjective understanding on certain market transactions. Subsequently, they can obtain a common reference on the scarcity of goods and services as objects via market prices, which is of obvious importance for economic well-being. We explain this in more detail in the book chapter, and we'll come back on it in a later chapter on market analysis.
How does the third-person view enter the picture then?
Well, on the one hand, economists as observers can obtain references directly from the objectivized second-person view of market prices. A standard measure here would be GDP per capita. On the other hand, there are also measures relating to well-being that are independent of market prices and directly relate to science such as biology or medicine. A key example here is life expectancy.
As we see, what emerges here is a fairly complex picture that we will apply and exemplify in many places of our book. One thing seems to be relatively clear already at this stage. The combination of these perspectives establishes economics as a methodologically pluralist science that needs to take into account results from other disciplines such as psychology and sociology.
Indeed. And this is how we place economics in the larger realm of the sciences. But it does not yet answer the question what economics is actually about. This is the next issue that we need to tackle.
Might we already have a good answer from established economics here? Lionel Robbins famously defined economics as science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. This reference to scarcity as core concept of economics would probably be agreed upon by most economists. It could be complemented by a reference to the economy, the Greek oikos, as object of study, which is about the use of scarce resources for production and consumption. All this sounds very reasonable indeed, doesn't it?
Well, unfortunately, things are not that straightforward. One problem with these definitions is that they do not put workable limits on the discipline. When you think about it, there's hardly any domain of human behavior that is not related to the use of scarce resources. It just depends on how you define resources. If, for example, you include time as such as a resource, as it is routinely done in labor economics, economics essentially crowds out psychology as a discipline.
And this is not only theoretical. In the wake of economic imperialism, economists have in fact applied their methods to the psychological realm, as well as to non-human decision-making in biology. Scientists of the concerned disciplines have not exactly been enthusiastic about these attempts.
Another problem is that an objectified definition of the economy does not take into account second-person views. For example, it is not clear whether building of a religious temple can and should be counted as an economic activity, given that builders may have entirely non-economic motivations. Of course, the economist may insist on its economic nature, given scarcity of resources, but this may bring him in a contradiction with other sciences such as anthropology, which regards the economy primarily as a cultural construct. And needless to say, the typical behavioral assumption on market-based behavior can easily put into question by other disciplines. Ultimately, the economic approach would become an interpretive stance among many, appearing as a proverbial elephant touched by several blind people at different parts.
This is hardly a satisfactory result. But what would be the alternative?
Our approach is to define economics as the science of markets, understood as material objects, such as the local markets in old China that we have described in the previous chapter. This is a definition in terms of a material object, not a methodology or set of abstract concepts.
But doesn't that correspond to many established approaches, given that those focus on market behavior?
No, because market behavior in those views is defined in axiomatic terms, such as maximization of utility and profit, and markets are foremost described in terms of an abstract unitary model. In contrast, we are referring to markets as real-world phenomena of great diversity, for example, in terms of behavioral patterns, types of individual and organizational actors involved, and structures of trading and interaction.
And this takes us again to the necessity of methodological pluralism and a cross-disciplinary approach, since an analysis of these phenomena involves knowledge from many fields.
There's another key feature of our markets. We include the performative role of economics for markets.
Performativity is a concept that originated in linguistic philosophy. The idea is that performative speech acts have the capacity to not only describe reality, but shape it on the basis of mutual recognition. Think of a registrar declaring a couple to be married. But what does that have to do with economics and markets?
Well, first of all, it's rather clear that such performative acts shape markets as well. Think of fiat money. Its value can only be established by mutual recognition of acts of exchange of goods and services against money. The value, in this case, purchasing power of fiat money, exclusively relies on such performative acts.
What is the role of economics as a science in this context, then?
The main point is that economic concepts of models can shape markets in a performative way. Think of accounting. The categories of value that it encompasses are not just out there. They are effectively created by the practice of accounting itself, and subsequently become the object of market action, for example, with respect to investment decisions that rely on methods of calculating company value or profit. Generally, we see co-evolutionary relationship between economics as a science and its object, namely markets. This is of huge importance for the development of markets in many historical contexts, not least the Western one.
On this historical perspective, you will find more in our book chapter. But there are also many current examples for the creation of markets that are first driven by theoretical considerations. Think of markets for greenhouse gas emission rights, the establishment of tradable fishing rights, or the design of auctions of radio spectrum licensees for mobile phone networks. Economics co-creates markets. And of course, the development of those markets is then further reflected by economics, based on its observation of these markets.
Exactly. And this leads back to our placement of economics in the sciences that we talked about earlier. Since there is no clear line of demarcation between the discipline and its real-world object, economics as a science of markets cannot take the role of a purely explanatory science from a third-person view. Instead, it needs to combine market information as an objectified second-person view with a third-person view on material aspects of markets, such as energetic properties of production.
This concludes our placement of economics in the world of sciences. But all of this is still rather abstract. It seems that we now need more substance on how economics can actually explain market processes. At first glance, this appears to be very difficult. Markets are hugely complex. They are constituted by millions of agents of different types. They follow rules of operation that can be very complicated, and they develop complex historical trajectories over time. They are also open systems in a double sense. First, they are inextricably connected with all other domains of human societies and the Earth system. And second, they endogenously create novelty, such as new goods and services. So is there actually any way to obtain general causal explanations beyond purely individual descriptions?
Certainly not in the sense of a grand theory, such as general equilibrium theory, which necessarily fails in taking into account all the points you have mentioned. But we can still apply a medium range approach that can provide explanations of a more limited phenomena, such as the consequences of price changes in the specific markets. Following recent developments in the philosophy of sciences, we call this a mechanistic approach. A mechanism, in this basic sense, is essentially a combination of entities and activities that causally generate a certain phenomenon.
To an economist, of course, the basic price mechanism comes to mind. If the supply of a good increases, its price will drop. Would that fit into the mechanistic approach?
And not really, because it is underspecified. The proper identification of a mechanism first requires an elaborate description of the material phenomena in question. For example, which markets are we referring to? What drives the behavior of the actors in this market? Against this, the standard price mechanism can serve as a mechanism sketch at best that would have to be enriched by taxonomy of other mechanisms, such as those relating to human behavior that can be categorized along different types of economic agents.
Which role does the notion of a model play in this context?
A model is basically a simulation of a real-world mechanism without attaining and indeed intending to attain the complexity of the real-world mechanism. Models are simplifying devices in the sense of identifying causal forces for certain phenomena derived from the respective mechanism sketches.
This seems rather close to what standard textbooks would introduce as well. A model as a simplified depiction of reality that allows for the derivation of testable hypotheses.
The difference is really in the level of abstraction and relation to material reality. Take the example of addiction to gambling. Economics would try to explain this behavior under the generic concept of an individual rational agent. However, in the mechanistic approach, as we understand it, addictive behavior would have to be carefully dissected into different mechanisms, such as on the neuronal level, but also in terms of social dynamics. This would then result into a model where certain forces generate observable patterns of addictive behavior in this realm. And notably, forces are never more than propensities. Mechanisms in open systems are stochastic in a deep sense.
Really, if we adopt this perspective, we return to what turns out the recurrent theme of this chapter, and indeed our book, namely the indispensable necessity of a cross-disciplinary approach. It seems that this puts limits on the role of quantification and research driven by statistical data as well. Many mechanisms are of a qualitative nature, and the focus on data can unduly restrict the search for underlying generative forces. And a model does not necessarily have to be formulated in mathematical terms, as many economists would have us believe, but can also be of a qualitative nature.
Indeed, the mechanistic approach can avoid what is sometimes jokingly referred to as the drunken man who searches his lost key where the light is, while ignoring places in darkness where he may possibly have lost it. A pure reliance on quantitative data, which is routine in much of economic analysis, too often loses sight of the trash in, trash out principle. You cannot improve the analytical value of a faulty data set by performing sophisticated econometric analysis on it. And it also creates an over-reliance of research results on statistical activity. We have an example for this in the realm of international trade in our book chapter.
Another key example is the role of institutions for market behavior. In principle, this has been recognized by economists, but again applied mainly via quantitative data sets, such as from the OECD or the World Bank, which I often worked with in my previous role as a government official. These data sets have their merits, but clearly strong limitations as well. And they need to be complemented by qualitative research such as in the literature of Varieties of Capitalism.
Let us now turn to the last major concept of this chapter, which in a way generalizes what we have said about performativity and the role of second and third person views before. The social sciences, including economics, differ from the natural science in that they deal with human agents who can understand an assertion or theory and change their behavior accordingly, which will in turn impact on the explanatory value of the theory. This is commonly called reflexivity.
But is reflexivity in any way an empirically relevant phenomenon? An average citizen does not read economics textbooks, after all.
Well, there are groups of people not unimportant to the economy and certainly do. The students of economics have been shown to become more individualist, rational, and opportunistic by studying economics. And financial market participants may change market results by applying theoretical pricing models, such as the Merton-Black-Scholes formula for option contracts to their transactions. But people may also adapt their expectations to theory-based economic policies, as shown by the famous Lucas critique.
Robert Lucas was a Nobel Prize-winning economist who became most famous for elaborating the idea of rational expectations in macroeconomics.
He certainly overdid the role of rationality in decision-making. But his point that is relevant here was that the parameters of macroeconomic models, once applied to policies, may become endogenous as a consequence of people's reactions to those policies. An example is the Phillips curve.
One of the leading macroeconomic concepts in Western market economies of the 1960s and 1970s. It implied a trade-off between inflation and unemployment that could be exploited politically, for example, by inflating the economy in order to achieve lower unemployment.
Exactly. But this essentially meant to trick employees and trade unions into acceptance of lower real wages, leading to an increase in employment. And once they understood what was going on, they would revise their inflation expectations upward and act accordingly in terms of demands for nominal wage increases. Eventually, the Phillips curve broke down. This is an example of reflexivity, even if rarely framed in this way.
What does all this mean for economics as a science?
Well, it essentially reinforces the methodological demands that we have already formulated. Economics must establish a reflective loop between the second and third person view, and it must seriously use second person views beyond market prices as an explanatory source.
Complementary to expectations, a chief example are narratives, which we will explore in more detail later in this book. They drive market behavior in many contexts, and economic theory can become one of those narratives itself.
Another consequence lies in the self-understanding of economists, particularly in the academic realm, who can no longer simply regard themselves as outside bystanders, but must reflect on their role in society and the consequences of their theories.
This is not without dangers, of course. Totalitarian systems have always regarded the social sciences and economics as endogenous part of a political effort. And even in Western democracies, there is an increasing trend to explicitly require research to serve societal values, such as diversity.
That is why, especially in the academic realm, pluralism as well as a deep factual knowledge of the issues involved remain essential values. We present a deeper account of these questions at the very end of this book. And finally, there is the issue of access to public understanding. While quantitative modeling certainly needs to remain an important part of economic reasoning, its key means of communication should remain verbal. Too often, economists pretend expertise by hiding rather simple arguments behind arcane mathematical models.
This concludes our observations on economics as a science, which will be foundational for the further course of our argument. Let us summarize our main insights.
We started with some fundamental objections to the aspiration of many economists to establish economics as a quasi-natural science whose core is the quantitative testing of hypotheses. Instead, we placed economics in an intermediate position, between the humanities, with a focus on interpretation and endogenous understanding, and the natural sciences, with a focus on explaining. Therefore, economics must triangulate first, second, and third-person views on the economy, which implies a pluralist and interdisciplinary perspective.
We then established a definition of economics, not in terms of its method, but its main object, namely markets, which are understood as material objects rather than a set of abstract behavioral principles. This dovetails with a long tradition of which Alfred Marshall was an important representative and precludes economic imperialism into other sciences.
Combining this with our differentiation views, we then said that economics is necessarily a performative science, meaning that there's a co-evolutionary relationship between economics and its object, namely markets. This is borne out by many historical as well as current examples.
On the methodological level, we stressed the need for medium range rather than all-encompassing grand theories. Correspondingly, economists should focus on the identification of economic mechanisms that generate certain economic phenomena via a specific organization of constitutive elements. Mechanisms are described and analyzed via models, which can be both of a qualitative mathematical and qualitative nature.
We stressed the role of reflexivity in economics. That is, the fact that economic agents understand, apply, and respond to economic theories. In extension, how agents reflexively constitute markets by wider ideation or constructs is an important type of data in economic analysis. Also, since economics is performative and reflexive, economists must take responsibility for their research and how it affects real-world phenomena, in particular via the impact on people's behavior.
Brings us to the end of our presentation. In the next chapter, we will deal with the role of values for economic science. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.